Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly super relevant topic from our source material. We're going to break down how the psychological mechanics behind modern cancel culture, especially when it radicalizes and hyper-focuses on traits like gender and skin color, can actually escalate into the foundational building blocks of a dictatorship of thought. We'll be looking objectively at how this dynamic risks imposing a sort of neo-racism, one that basically ostracizes whichever section of the population it decides to accuse of all societal evils. So let's jump right in.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer today. We're looking at the psychology of social mimicry, cancel culture, and retrospective purity, the great ideological divide, the trap of absolute purity, and finally, pathways to a dictatorship.
Section 1. The psychology of social mimicry. How we learn by watching others.
To really get what's driving societal outrage, the sources tell us we actually need to start with clinical psychology. Specifically, Albert Bandura's concept of vicarious reinforcement. It's a brilliant insight, really. It shows that humans naturally copy behaviors we see getting rewarded, and we steer clear of behaviors we see punished. You don't even have to experience the reward or punishment yourself. Just watching someone else go through it is totally enough to change how you act.
And, well, this perfectly explains what happens when you throw the internet into the mix. Social media platforms are basically giant amplifiers for this natural human instinct. Step 1, we have this digital quest for quantifiable validation, chasing likes and shares. Step 2, algorithms heavily favor and amplify uniform trends. And Step 3, users dive into widespread instant behavioral mimicry. The digital world takes our very natural desire to fit in and turns it into a hyper-fast, highly visible machine.
Which brings us to Section 2, cancel culture and retrospective purity, the quest to sanitize the past.
So this digital mimicry sets the perfect stage for modern cancel culture. The text actually describes this as a radical form of vicarious punishment, or more specifically, deconstructive vicarious punishment. It's kind of a hybrid between behavioral psychology and postmodern philosophy. Think of it like this. Punishing one individual becomes a highly visible public lesson. It's meant to educate everyone watching and theoretically dismantle broader cultural bias, basically making an example of one person to teach the whole crowd.
But the text points out that this dynamic doesn't just stop at people who are alive today. It reaches backward in time to create what the sources call retrospective purity. The goal is to essentially cleanse our historical and cultural heritage. We see this happening when terminology deemed offensive is altered in classic books, like the works of Roald Dahl or Agatha Christie. It's adding moral context and warnings to older movies, or taking down statues of historical figures tied to colonialism and slavery.
Now, how do historians actually categorize this phenomenon? While it might be tempting for some to compare this to biological regimes, the sources note that historians point us in a totally different direction. They compare this modern climate to the reputation-destroying witch hunts of McCarthyism in the 1950s, or the absolute obsession with political virtue during the French Revolution's reign of terror. It's not about state-sanctioned biological determinism, it's entirely about intense ideological and behavioral purity.
Section 3. The Great Ideological Divide. Collectivism versus individual responsibility.
At the absolute core of this debate over historical memory is a massive clash between two very different worldviews. On one side, the text maps out a collectivist approach, often championed by decolonial activism. This views history through intersectionality, focusing on structures of domination, white privilege, and the idea of an inherited systemic debt. Directly clashing with that is the individualist approach. This worldview focuses heavily on individual responsibility, modern legal principles, and the very real historical reality of social class struggles.
To really highlight this individualist perspective on hereditary guilt, which often stems from focusing strictly on someone's ancestry, the source offers this pretty powerful analogy. It argues that blaming a citizen today for the acts of their ancestors is logically equivalent to making them serve a prison sentence for a crime their grandfather committed. It directly violates the fundamental premise of modern law, that individuals are only responsible for their own actions.
Furthermore, the sources argue there's a huge blind spot here regarding social classes. Framing history purely through a modern racial or gender-based lens completely ignores the fact that the vast majority of historical Western populations were just impoverished workers and peasants. They were totally at the mercy of a tiny ruling elite. So asking the descendants of those historical working classes to repent today, the text notes that this creates a profound sense of injustice and polarization.
And this polarization leads to a really critical warning from the sources, the trap of inversion. By adopting methods of essentialization, meaning reducing a complex human being down to just a single trait like the race or gender, radical movements risk reproducing the exact same mechanisms of oppression they claim to be fighting. By focusing so heavily on these traits, they risk imposing a form of neo-racism that just ends up ostracizing whichever group is currently being accused of historical evils.
Section 4, the trap of absolute purity, the pursuit of dogmatic absolutes. This trap we just talked about is ultimately driven by a slide into what the sources call Manichaean ideological purity. It's a mechanism of intense intellectual radicalization. Basically, thought gets locked into this ultra-rigid binary structure. There is no middle ground. The world is strictly divided into absolute good, the pure who perfectly follow the doctrine, and absolute evil, the opponents, the traitors, or literally anyone who disagrees.
The operational pillars of this approach are severe. First, it requires a systematic rejection of all nuance and gray areas. Everything is black and white. Second, there's an obsessive focus on the enemy within, constantly hunting for anyone in the group who might be considered lukewarm or slightly deviant from the core ideology. And third, there's a constant rhetorical and radical escalation, because you constantly have to prove your absolute purity to the rest of the group to stay legitimate.
And the fascinating, yet incredibly destructive result of this, according to the sources, is the implosion of the pure. Because the demands for ideological purity just keep escalating, the circle of people who are actually deemed pure enough inevitably shrinks. It just gets smaller and smaller until the movement eventually has no one left to cancel but itself, and it completely implodes.
Section 5. Pathways to a Dictatorship. How ideological rigidity mirrors authoritarianism.
Let's see how these micro-actions scale up. If we cross-reference the documented traits of a classic dictatorship with the manifestations of extreme cancel culture outlined in the text, the structural parallels are pretty startling. Instead of systematic state censorship, we see the erasure of past works and deconstructive punishment. Instead of an outright ban on political pluralism, there's a systematic rejection of nuance and gray areas. And instead of state-run repression and terror, the modern equivalent relies on intense, horizontal digital pressure and the rapid destruction of reputations.
The big difference really lies in the delivery mechanism. A traditional state dictatorship uses top-down tools, like a state apparatus or secret police, to punish anyone who deviates from the official line. But the sources argue that this modern dynamic achieves very similar censorship through intense peer-to-peer pressure. It acts as a dictatorship of thought, where digital mobs ostracize and punish people the very second they step out of line with current moral standards.
Ultimately, both systems find a way to completely bypass the rule of law. Just as a dictatorship abolishes legal recourse and constitutional protection for its citizens, digital punishment bypasses the fundamental principles of individual responsibility and due process. It entirely trades a fair legal trial for immediate, absolute public sanction. So instead of a single dictator's face plastered on a billboard, we get a cult of ideology. The system establishes an infallible doctrine. The sources point out that it exploits educational and cultural institutions to rigidly define who is pure and meticulously identifies internal enemies who are then blamed for all societal evils. It's a framework that imposes a form of neo-racism to ostracize specific sections of the population, effectively cementing a dictatorship of thought. Which leaves us with a really vital question to ponder from the source material. If our quest for moral purity demands the absolute erasure of nuance and the widespread ostracization of our fellow citizens, are we truly dismantling historical oppression? Or, in our pursuit of a perfectly pure society, are we simply building the architecture for a new dictatorship of thought? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this objective breakdown gave you some really fascinating concepts to chew on.